Hello and welcome to this IT Pro webinar presented in association with Carbon Black. Today we'll be talking about counter-incident response and how attackers are using techniques like island hopping and network traversal to maintain their hold on networks. I'm joined by Andrew Costas, threat researcher from Carbon Black, and Ian Thornton-Trump, the European Head of Cybersecurity for Amtrust International. Andrew, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your role at Carbon Black.
Yeah, so general background, so I've been in the tech industry for about 17 years. My current role as a threat researcher, primarily I look at commodity malware and e-crime. So I work for a global team called the TAO team, which is the threat analysis unit. And we pretty much focus specifically on both APT and commodity malware, but my particular area of expertise is e-crime and commodity malware.
Excellent, thank you very much. Ian, what about yourself?
Well, the role right now is really a leadership role, driving a team and participating in multiple cross-business projects to bring security to the table and try and get security implemented on products and services before they go to production. I'd say that as a large financial organization, we see daily attacks on the estate, and we are getting well-versed in incident response.
Excellent. My name is Adam Shepherd. I am the Reviews and Community Editor for IT Pro, and I will be moderating this discussion. As a reminder, you can submit questions. We will be answering them at the end. But for now, let's dive straight in. First of all, let's talk about counter-incident response. So, Andrew, what do we mean when we talk about counter-incident response?
Yeah, so I think historically the term anti-forensics has been kind of more widely used. We've kind of put a different spin on it by labeling it as counter-incident response. I think more just to home in on the fact that it's not just anti-forensics, but it actually affects the post-breach investigation phase. So by counter-incident response, there's many techniques as well as tools to kind of make the incident responder's job much more difficult.
Okay. Ian, is this a new thing or is this something that you've seen growing for a long time?
I think it's always been there. What I'm excited about is sort of getting a term into the lexicon of language that really resonates with what the threat looks like today. This is 100% correct. Not only is the malware that we're dealing with more difficult to reverse engineer, but indications of compromise can change dynamically inside a box that's attacked. And then you also have the whole issue of the malicious actors wiping and reducing the amount of evidence that suggests that they've attacked successfully and have hung into the network itself. So it really describes a broad spectrum of techniques that malicious actors are using today.
Okay. Andrew, why has this become so popular among attackers?
I think native tools, for example, if we take the Microsoft Windows operating system, we're talking about technologies such as PowerShell and WMI. Living off the land binary is a huge thing now, not just for APT and nation-state-based attacks, but also for commodity malware. And so, obviously, some of our key findings about the counter-IR part of the Global Threat Report was obviously...
And that's Carbon Black's Global Threat Report.
Indeed, yeah. So some of the figures were like 98% of breaches investigated by our IR partners, 98% of which were using PowerShell as part of the attack, 83% using WMI. So it's become, I guess, more preferable for the attackers to use LOL bins and frameworks that come with the operating system as opposed to preloading tools that may stand a greater chance of detection.
Okay. And Ian, this kind of rise of commodity malware, how does this compare to nation-state activity in terms of threats? Is this something that businesses should be more worried about than the actions of kind of potential state-sponsored actors?
Yeah, because I think it's now blending from the state-sponsored actors. Let's say, the adversaries have developed techniques and training and procedures to break into systems. Once you learn how to do that, you may not be happy with your current salary, and so you may get pretty entrepreneurial. And at that point, you get to take all of the information that you've acquired over your course of your career and now apply it to a more criminal enterprise and take some of those techniques with you. We've seen the weaponization of Eternal Blue in NotPetya as a great example of that attack, and Eternal Blue now is cropping up with other malicious actors. And it's interesting to me that one of the APT groups that we talk about is a group called PowerShell Empire. That's kind of a giveaway of what you can expect from that particular group in terms of like compromise and in terms of living off the land.
So we've mentioned kind of some of the big ones, tools like PowerShell, the kind of living off the land binaries, but what other counter-IR tools and tactics have you seen attackers using, Andrew?
Yeah, so from the feedback from our IR partners, 87% are seeing the destruction of logs. So it's a very, it's not a new technique, but it's obviously going to cause headaches for the investigators to make their life difficult if they can't trace back to patient zero, if you like. And similarly, evasion techniques. So 70% of attacks discovered by our partners were using evasion techniques. So malware techniques are becoming more sophisticated. So anything to make people like myself, our jobs difficult. So evading sandboxes, sleeping for a certain amount of time, lying dormant until all the stars align effectively. So there's lots of advanced techniques. Packed malware is becoming more common in commodity malware as well. So, and a lot of these techniques have been around for years, but they're becoming more prevalent in commodity malware. And probably because there's a lot of code sharing that goes on the underground. So a lot of the more, sophisticated attacks are kind of now being passed along the chain to the lower end attack groups that maybe aren't as well funded as nation states, but they certainly have access to the code and to be able to import libraries and make, banking Trojans just as sophisticated as an APT, for instance.
Okay. Ian, why do you think this kind of level of collaboration and code sharing within the kind of black hat community has increased to this degree? So
what we've seen is the monetization of the entire supply chain of malware, of credentials, of training that's available. Certainly at the nation state level, we've seen nation states that were lagging in terms of their cyber warfare programs. Basically, they started off with DDoS attacks and web defacement, and now they're creating some of the most sophisticated malware like TRIS that targets industrial control systems. So to see that evolution within a period of 10 years is a little bit chilling, to say the least. What we also need to keep in mind is that Stuxnet, at its high point, infected 115 countries. So this one attack that was used against the Iranian nuclear program then spread, and still spreads today, as a matter of fact. Really? So what we're seeing is that examples of this sophisticated malware are readily available in the ecosystem as well.
Okay, and what's the kind of knock-on effect for businesses who are dealing with maybe kind of lower level threats who aren't state linked but are kind of attempting to make use of these tools?
To just go kind of broader, the problems that businesses have right now from a cybersecurity perspective really boil down into two pieces. One is user awareness and education of the threat, and the second is their terrible technical debt that they have not serviced. Security would be easy if all the users knew what to do and the platforms were all secure. The reality is that the users in some cases are not particularly well trained or aware of the threat, and the technical debt has left the company incredibly vulnerable to even low-level attacks, not like the kind of the more crazy, difficult malware, but low-level attacks are effective. It's the high-level attacks that are devastating.
Okay. Andrew, is that something that you'd agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your security starts from the inside with your user base. Security champion programs are now becoming a thing. I believe they're actually in the top kind of 3 or 5 things that CISOs are concerned with. So but there's definitely no silver bullet approach to security. It's a complex challenge, and there's multiple layers and multiple moving parts. But not only that, but the threat landscape is evolving all the time. So techniques are changing, tools are changing. We have frameworks like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is helping for the defenders to understand behavioral impacts, and not just from the blue team, but also from the red team perspectives. And that's obviously helping a great deal. But there's still a lot of work to do. And we work in an evolving industry. So unfortunately, there's no silver bullet.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about some of those kind of behavioral patterns that you mentioned. How does that manifest in practice for defenders?
Yeah, so I mean, if you specifically, I can give you a simple example. So we at Carbon Black, we've personally mapped some of the behaviours into our products. So whereas before, indicators of compromise would generally have a very short time to live, if you like, or a short shelf life. The problem with that is for complex malware, such as banking Trojans, IP addresses, file names, they dynamically change very frequently. So an IP address may be live 1 minute, and the next minute it's gone offline, never to be seen again. So the whole idea of mapping to behavior frameworks, such as the MITRE ATT&CK framework, is to be able to kind of latch on, if you like, to persistence. So persistence, there's several techniques of persisting, for example, in the Windows registry. Frameworks such as that are greatly beneficial, but we're seeing a lot of techniques, but being able to understand them and interpret them from like a high-level model, such as the ATT&CK framework, makes all of our jobs much easier.
Okay. Ian, how can security teams adapt to these kind of counter-IR techniques? Do they need to develop counter-IR?
Yeah, it seems like it's the never-ending scenario. So understanding what normal looks like, I think, is the best place to start. But understanding that the adversary is going to move a lot faster than what we originally sort of started growing up with, that the attack now and the island hopping lateral movement that takes place in the network is done in minutes. So all of the techniques that we use to secure the network, from things like honeypots to secure log storage, so that you can do IR and you have logs. Nothing is more disconcerting, I think, for a responder to go into a situation and find that there are no logs. The machine has been wiped by an incredibly helpful IT resource that wants to get the business up and running, but didn't maybe pay attention to, we're actually dealing with an incident right now. So you have these coordination issues, but I think probably the most important thing is to build capacity of your team. And you can do that through automated solutions. You can do that by tabletop exercises. And you will probably be doing that in a live scenario, given the threat landscape that's out there for small, medium enterprises.
Okay. Andrew, have you seen any particularly successful techniques that security teams have used to combat counter-IR?
Obviously having a good EDR product in place is always going to help with IR, but more specifically having a good IR plan in place. So often the IR plan only really comes to light when there's a breach and the realization of there is no IR plan, unfortunately. So having the key stakeholders in place, having the legal team on side, knowing how to deal with the press. There's lots of factors to be able to respond, but there's a lot of preparation that has to go in to make a efficient IR plan. So you're certainly starting from the ground and building up.
Okay. So I'd like to move on now to something that you touched on briefly in island hopping. So I wonder if, Andrew, you could tell us a little bit more about what you define island hopping as, how you see it and how it affects the kind of modern security landscape.
Yeah, so I think historically, island hopping has probably in a past life previously been more well known as supply chain attacks. So thinking back to 2013, the Target breach, that was kind of probably the bit for its time, that was certainly the biggest supply chain attack. And for the years that kind of followed, there was obviously more breaches that came to light that involved supply chain attacks. I guess Carbon Black decided to kind of coin the term, island hopping as more of a kind of umbrella term, because supply chain attacks, there's actually multiple forms of supply chain attacks. So that's kind of how we expanded out and elaborated by using, island hopping. So for instance, watering hole attacks is one such example. More traditional network-based attacks is another, and also reverse business email compromise. So there's actually lots of attack vectors that fall under the island hopping category. So rather than us just referring to supply chain attacks, which only talks to one such example, that's why we kind of decide to use that particular verbiage.
Okay, so I wonder if you could dig in a little bit more to some of those component attacks that make up the kind of overall term of island hopping. Let's start with watering hole attacks. How much of a risk does that pose to today's kind of modern security environment?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, so watering holes, network-based attacks, reverse business email compromise, they're all high risk. But they all have a common theme, which is that there's usually a trusted third party that gets compromised first, and then the attacker then uses that to pivot and kind of springboard into their actual victim company, if you like, or target company to accomplish their goals. So those are kind of more, that's kind of the general kind of feel for those types of attacks. But in terms of, did you want specific examples, or?
If you have any, that would be excellent.
I mean, Ian, did you want to?
Sure. APT10 Cloud Hopper.
Of course.
These guys target MSPs. They move into the MSP environment. They leverage the MSP's authority as an administrative organization. They phish on behalf of that MSP to those customers. That lands them in that environment under the guise of the MSP. And this is also without the MSP knowing what was going on. And then get in there and then use the MSP's own tools to exfiltrate the data. And these guys have been around since before 2015. 2015 is when PwC broke the news along with BAE Systems in a report at Kaspersky SAS. But they speculate that these guys have been in business since, I think, 2012, 2010. MSPs globally, very trusted providers. And then when this kind of thing happens, it's really bad news. Some other classics that I've seen is where companies that proudly proclaim that they're in the cloud, everything we have is in the cloud. What they fail to understand is that that's great, except for those workstations without two-factor authentication on the credentials now become the target, and the pivot is into the cloud where all the data and customer information is. And I mean, we've seen attacks where they get a hold of those workstations, and within hours, all of the customer data is exfiltrated to another cloud service, and they tend to try and burn any evidence that they were actually in those systems. So sophisticated attackers and moving fast these days. And I think of island hopping as a really neat way of looking at the World War II campaign by the Americans as they hopped from one island to one island with the intensive purposes of defeating the Japanese in small bite-sized chunks. And to flip it to the modern day metaphor, what we're seeing is the seizing of small pieces of a business's asset, its supply chain, probing for weaknesses, and then the big compromise takes place.
Okay. Andrew, what advantage does this approach give attackers versus just attacking their primary target head on and devoting all their resources to that?
So it's almost like doubling up on what their ultimate goal is. So rather than compromising one company, their original target company, they get two for the price of one. So if they go through a trusted third-party supplier that happens to have very low security barriers on entry, then they not only use that to springboard, but they also use that to perhaps compromise a database in that company, or financial data, or PII data, and so on.
Okay. Now, you mentioned business email compromise as well. Is this just the common or garden phishing attacks that we're all kind of familiar with, or is this something a bit deeper?
So it's kind of like spear phishing, but usually going for high-profile targets, such as executive members of the board. Typically whale-in attacks that rely on compromising of an email server internally. And that's where you need to kind of think about, auditing and account mailbox and permission auditing. Having fine, controls, granular controls for the permissions model, and monitoring, for things like mailbox activations or locking accounts and so on, because those are typical patterns observed through reverse, business compromise via emails, email servers rather, that have been compromised.
Okay. What role does user education have to play in all of this? Is there any benefit to companies beyond the obvious for putting time and resources into making sure that their users are aware to look out for these kind of warning signs? Or is it better to just invest heavily in, for example, security operations centers and the actual security infrastructure within the business?
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate for sort of educating the users. So, talking about simplistic examples of, even just giving general advice to your family, but that follows through to the workplace. And security isn't something that you just tick off a list, and once you've learned about it, you'll never have to read up on it again. As practitioners, we spend most of our lives reading and trying to stay up to date with the latest threats and so on. And that has to be kind of, put down into layman's terms for people that aren't technical, but it also needs to be kind of ongoing as well. So that, as I say, once a year is better than no times a year. However, like just having that constant reminders and refreshers and kind of education is a big part of. It can at least avoid some of the typical social engineering type attacks. And social engineering doesn't always have to be, email phishing attacks. They can be people phoning up, and just phishing for information over the phone, and just trying numbers to get hold of, someone's contact details or email address, because that can even lead to the very beginning of an attack.
Ian, what are your thoughts on this?
It's one of the most challenging issues that we have. I mean, when you look at the threat landscape, it's from the simplest attack right up to, advanced persistent threat actors. It can be overwhelming for people in your organization. And so I think to be effective, you have to really take a program that educates about what the risk looks like for your business. How many businesses here tell their employees, these are our crown jewels, these are the databases that, if they're compromised, it's devastating for our company. We need to be clear about what we're protecting, and I think then it'll be easier to protect it. The other thing, I agree 100% that it has to be an ongoing commitment, education and continued updates on, what do the threats look like for our organization or our industry vertical. Those are all very good teaching points. And then the last thing I would add is try to expand your security program for your users to encompass their offline lives as well as, hey, what we're trying to do at our business, if you use it in your personal life, if you use multi-factor authentication on your Amazon account, on your PayPal account, on your email, you're less likely to ever become victimized by these type of attacks, which our business face, but also you at home face. And really try to connect it together in sort of security training that's applicable to all the different places that we find ourselves.
So going back to the network-based attacks that you were talking about earlier, Andrew, what are some of the most common network traversal paths that you've seen in your career?
Yeah, so again, living off the land tools are a common place for attackers to kind of home in on, just because they're easy, they're often pre-installed, and you can use tools like PowerShell and again WMI and other frameworks to move laterally and then infect. Obviously, we know. Dare I say it, WannaCry was the reason why it was very successful is because it had worm-like capabilities, and as Ian mentioned, Eternal Blue, Double Pulsar exploits that were effectively released kind of unethically from the NSA, let's say. But that led to obviously the outage, huge outage of multiple companies throughout Europe as well as the NHS here in the UK. So yeah, lots of tools, but often they're not custom tools, they're not bespoke tools. These are tools that have existed for over a decade.
Ian, are there any particular common points of entry into the network that you've seen that kind of crop up again and again as places where attackers gain an initial foothold and then use that as a staging ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, remote desktop is probably the one that is will live in infamy so far if it's not protected by VPN. The other is Outlook Web Access. One of the techniques that I've seen is where various passwords for user accounts that have been disclosed previously in a data breach, are tried against an Outlook web portal that belongs to that company. Once 2 or 3 accounts are known to provide access, then you pivot to whatever other services the organization may have. And especially if it's an IT person, there's a good chance you'll have administrative privileges and possibly be able to get into the demilitarized zone. So all sorts of havoc starts with this one, kind of entry. And I think one of the other things that I've seen is in order to enable persistence without being as I guess, noisy, is to change the DNS of the target to a DNS that you can control. So then you can start throwing up phishing pages for all of the other services that business might use, and then grab those credentials when they log into your fake web page credentials. So to me, it's like expect those things to be going on and implement technological controls to either detect or prevent that.
And that ties back into the watering hole attacks that you were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on those points, actually. So obviously, recently in the news, we've had the BlueKeep vulnerability that was exposed. We still haven't seen working exploit code. But again, a really old technology or service, once again, being exploited. So, yeah.
So I think I just do want to talk about BlueKeep. BlueKeep, I think the notification, the seriousness of it, all came up a lot higher. Before that, we had some vague warnings from US CERT. We had vague warnings from Microsoft. This was a big, alarm bell in the fire stations. I think when you're a malicious actor, criminal actor, you look at the risk versus the reward. And because a lot of these proof of concepts came out, ultimately BlueKeep was quite a noisy attack. And so, if you're in the anti-malware game, you had the opportunity to take that code, run it against your product, develop the heuristics, develop the behavioral-based characteristics, possibly even create definitions if you're super old school. But I feel like the industry responded with a level of urgency that was appropriate to the threat. In the future, who knows? And this is why, sort of we live in this state of constant hypervigilance. And maybe that explains some of the challenges that we have, retaining and bringing new people into this industry.
So just moving back to kind of supply chain attacks quickly before we move on. What can organizations do to minimize the impact of supply chain attacks within their own environments? Andrew, if we could start with you.
Yeah, I think they need to look at their trust relationships that they have with their third-party suppliers. So, it's all very well striking a deal with perhaps a remote contractor or some consulting company that you wish to do business with, but perhaps part of those checks should be to see, are they taking security as seriously as your own company? But obviously the technologies are out there and they do exist, things like zero trust, segmentation of networks. So again, no silver bullet, it's always a layered approach, lots of technologies that exist out there, but kind of taking all those into the equation are going to help not just to keep the attackers out, but also in a kind of post-breach kind of situation, and kind of using those different technologies and different approaches. And like, as I say, the real kind of key is the trust relationships. That kind of strengthens the security overall for both companies in the long run. Okay, so making security effectively part of due diligence.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blue Team, I like to say, starts at procurement. Know who is supplying and helping your company. Understand what access they do need and segregate them accordingly. So if you've hired a firm to look after one particular application, figure out a way to provide them access to that application with their credentials that they need, and then change your policies and insist on two-factor authentication. When you look at the cost of data breach of a large company versus coming up with a couple of more duo two-factor authentication, licenses, I mean, let's do some analysis and the math, right? If you're stingy over here, then really bad things are going to happen, if that partner gets compromised. I'm not saying the partner is, but potentially. The other thing is that within the terms and conditions of your contract, reserve the rights to get access to, even in a redacted form, their pen tests, their ISO 27001 certification, their due diligence documents, maybe even the first couple pages of their policies, just so that you have some presence of mind and some comfort with the fact that they're trying to align to best practices the way you're trying to align your business to best practices.
Because of course it's not just about your partners when it comes to the supply chain, but also about your partners' partners and your partners' partners' partners and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, yeah.
So how important would you say that kind of confidence is in knowing that your partners are not themselves going to get compromised by their own partners?
Yeah, so I think that's huge. I mean, when you're in the procurement, if you're not asking about, so what are some of the other companies that you're doing business with in my industry vertical, can you put forward 2 or 3 people that I can contact and ask, and get a reference? Just like the way we do when, we're hiring an individual, we ask for, a reference check and depending on what other checks are required for the job that you're doing. But I mean, we should apply these same principles, I think, to our vendor partners and understand what the risk to our organization would be if that partner is, compromised. If it's a very large scale deal where there's a lot of personal sensitive information that you're putting into, a third party cloud provider, you want to understand, okay, what security do you have? What notification will you give me? How do I verify, and what is the evidence that your data is encrypted at rest? Things like that. And I think having those discussions, businesses are now asking those questions in a lot of cases. I know that the new normal now is a several-page document that asks some pretty tough questions of where you are at in terms of your security level of competence.
I think the other thing to consider as well is traditionally, if you go back maybe 20 years or so, you had network security, so you had IDSs, you had firewalls, which you still have, but the endpoint now, with bring your own devices, the person is working from home. They don't have the same firewall or IDSs. Yes, they may be using some kind of security on the local operating system, but it's those things to consider that, the demarcation point now is the end user, not just from technical attacks, but also from social engineering as well. It's much easier to perhaps compromise a user and then pivot from their home network into the company because they've already got, authentication configured and access control lists, allowing access straight into the company.
Is there such a thing as the security perimeter anymore, as we've traditionally thought of it?
I don't think so. No, I think we it's pretty much ubiquitous now that we are all mobile. Many people work from home or on the go, coffee shops and alike. So, certainly I think the perimeter is not so much there anymore. It probably does exist for, server side, but certainly client side, not so much.
Ian, does that chime with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I feel the needle is sitting there in the center, and, we're looking at, GeoIP filtering or putting in a different scrutiny based on the origin of where the data traffic is coming from. But at the same time, the data traffic can be coming from anywhere. So, I think there's a real challenge. And I think from the technical network, you're 100% correct that really, the perimeter is everywhere. It's all around us. From a let's guard our most important business assets, I think the perimeter becomes more defined based on the policies that the organization is going to have. So if you are a contractor and you're working with defense industry information, then I think you're going to have a very defined policy-driven perimeter that requires, a whole bunch of things, up-to-date malware, up-to-date machine, otherwise you're put into the quarantine and you don't get out of it until all of those things are updated. So I think we're starting to enforce that idea that the perimeter is just, I don't care what you show up with, but it better have these, 4 or 5 things in place, otherwise you don't get access.
Okay. So I'd like to move on to something that you touched on earlier, Andrew, the Carbon Black Global Incident Threat Report. We've covered some of the themes already, but I wondered if you could run us through the kind of key takeaways from the findings.
Yeah, sure. So the Carbon Black Incident Response Threat Report. So essentially, this is a survey that's sent out to something like 100 or more IR partners across the globe. So it is in fact a global report and not just a representation of the UK or America. And we're really proud of it. So we've got something like, as I say, 100 or more incident response partners across the globe. And I think the kind of figure was something in the region of 500 or so incidents that they were investigating last year. So it's a really good sample set of data and a real good kind of representation of kind of boots on the ground, what are the front lines seeing? Because ultimately it's the IR partners that are out there cleaning up the mess after the attackers have done the damage. So it's really just an aggregate response of that survey data that's sent out. And everyone can benefit from it, from not just if you're a customer, MSSPs, and even people like myself, to understand and get more of an insight, a really valuable insight into what the IR partners are seeing. Okay,
so what are some of the top line results that you've seen?
Yeah, so we've discussed obviously island hopping and counter IR. So 50% of attacks make up island hopping, quite substantial, and 56% of attacks make up counter IR. The other facts, top findings, are that the financial and the healthcare industries are the top 2 targeted attacks industries. So doesn't come as a huge surprise, but both for different reasons, in fact. So financial obviously contains a lot of financial and ultimately profit. But interestingly, healthcare is the number 2 targeted industry. And there's probably many reasons for that. Mainly, I think, because there's lots of personally identifiable information, patient records, which are really almost just as valuable as financial profit in some respects, which can lead on to insurance fraud, for instance. The other factor that comes into play with specifically the healthcare industry is there's lots of IoT devices, lots of old medical equipment that can't be replaced. And there's lots of old legacy operating systems that, again, can't be replaced because they're running, life support machines. So, not really much of a surprise to me, but healthcare is right up there now.
Okay. That's healthcare in particular is one that we've seen compromised repeatedly. Obviously, it was a large victim of the WannaCry attack, but also other outbreaks of ransomware and even targeted attacks have had large impacts on healthcare and hospitals in particular, practicing hospitals. How do you think that hospitals and healthcare organizations can take steps to protect themselves from these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, I mean, again, so many possible solutions and recommendations, but things like patching. So one of the reasons why WannaCry was so successful was because it was using an old a vulnerability, and of course the impacted customers, including the NHS, were obviously hadn't patched, and for various reasons, obviously. There'll be two different kind of takes on the whole patching kind of conversation. So some people just think it's that easy, and reality is it often isn't. And there's a whole kind of change control process and approval process that has to happen for even just a medium-sized company to apply a critical update.
Okay, one of the things that we heard in the aftermath of WannaCry, many people were criticising the NHS for, as you say, kind of not adequately patching their systems, with people on the other side arguing that a lot of the unpatched equipment within the NHS, aside from the desktops and client endpoints, were embedded devices in things like MRI machines and X-ray scanners and hospital equipment that couldn't be patched for one reason or another, whether it's that the manufacturer had gone out of business or stopped supporting it, or that it just wasn't accessible. What's your take on patching in general, Ian?
So it's a problem. Done incorrectly, it can put in unpredictable downtime into your organization. Having said that, where the NHS, I think, really failed was at a network architecture level. So if you can't protect it, don't connect it. It's that simple. If it needs to be connected, figure out especially which protocol, which port, to which IP address, and build specific rules so it can't go anywhere else. It's called VLANing, it's called network segmentation. Unfortunately, a lot of these hospital networks are completely flat, which means a compromise of one device can lead to the compromise of all of the other devices on that network. So I think, when people come back and say the NHS has no money, I think a couple of things. The first is WannaCry was an accident that wiped out 20% of the NHS's capability on the ground when it hit. Imagine if this was a targeted attack. Okay, so put that into the threat model, and then all of a sudden I think that the IT guys that are on the ground at hospitals, sometimes there's only 3 or 4 of them, managing 4,000 or 5,000 plus network devices. And, all of a sudden I think you need to understand that in order for doctors and the healthcare system to work, IT needs to work. So yes, is it difficult to spend the money in IT? I 100% agree. However, if IT doesn't work, healthcare doesn't work. So somewhere there needs to be somebody that comes in and says, here's the 5-year plan, here's the 2-year plan, here's the next 6 months plan, we have to deal with it. And I think what's been happening in healthcare particularly is, folks are running around, they're working super hard, their hair is on fire, and hospital administration isn't taking the threat seriously enough. Okay. So it's a combination problem, which are some of the tough ones to solve.
I think just on that last point as well, Ian, I know personally I have a number of friends and family that work in various capacities in the NHS, and a really common thing is just kind of this credential sharing, and because they don't have time, if it's a priority of logging in with the right access control, or just using someone else's account. When someone's come in through the accident and emergency department, it's kind of a no-brainer, and that it goes back to our earlier discussion of user education training, it's an ongoing process. But we talk about the technical challenges, but there are still human elements that come into day-to-day run-ins of hospitals and the operational side. And as I say, account information sharing, password sharing, that kind of thing is still
yeah.
What do you think the split is? Are attackers more attracted to easier targets or more lucrative targets?
It's a hard one to. I mean, it totally depends, I think, on the threat actor. I mean, what we're seeing is certainly on the commodity side is take banking Trojans. So typically, I guess some people would associate banking Trojans of compromising credit cards or account numbers and so on. But quite often, banking Trojans are using key stealers to capture keyboard and mouse input. They want to know what websites you're going on. Sometimes even web camera modules. These banking Trojans are delivered modularly, so they depending on if they've infect a compromised machine, they may monitor it for a month or a few weeks, and if they decide that they happen to have infected a high value asset, then they may then load another module to capture network traffic to see which other hosts on the network it's talking to.
Okay, Ian, what's your thoughts?
That's a very accurate description, I think, of where we're at. My view is that the earlier you can detect it, the earlier you can remediate it. So one of the challenges that we have is rolling into an incident response and not actually having an up-to-date network map, or not even understanding what assets you do have. So to take it down one level, it's like, let's get the basics done first, and then we can start putting on these other components. But I know so many companies that are now, especially with today's news and the $183 million fine levied against BA, all of a sudden, executives are going to freak out. That's a huge number. Now, BA is going to fight it for sure. But even if they got it halved, it's still the largest fine that we've ever seen come out of the ICO. For anybody in the C-suite and any manager or director, I think this is a huge call to action. And having those basics will facilitate the more advanced layers to secure your enterprise. Without them, all your fancy stuff is going to do is tell you that you have an awful lot of work to do at the basic level.
So what do you think that the first thing security teams should do upon discovering an incident is? What's the first step when it comes to incident response? Andrew?
So there's a common kind of saying, I guess, which is do no harm. So quite often, the more investigators kind of fiddle and kind of go on hunches rather than technical fact and forensic evidence and artifacts, the more likelihood is that it's going to only delay and postpone the actual investigation. Often, as we know, it's not always possible to get to patient zero, but kind of good methodologies of having good IR practices in place, not kind of tampering too much with the network, and hunting quietly. So, there's a good chance that if you already have an attacker inside your network, there may be others as well. Usually if there's a C2 channel going outbound of your company that's been compromised, there could be other vectors that other attackers are already using. So don't be distracted by just that one compromise, because there could be several more lying dormant that you're unaware of.
Ian, does that chime with your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would add, you really want to try containment, but you have to know what to contain. So in the example where you've identified a C2 beaconing coming from your network out there, well, figure out, is it one box or is it 10 boxes? Once you understand now where the attacker is in your organization, then it's time to segment those boxes off. And notice I said do not turn them off, but segment them off. Because if it's more sophisticated malware, fileless malware, you're going to destroy valuable evidence and forensics for the incident responders. So this has to be a collaborative effort between the IR, the networking team, the support teams need to move quickly so that they can identify that, oh yeah, we're working with a live incident here. And then at the end of the day, and I'm a huge, and it's a controversial topic, but I'm a huge proponent of gathering as much information about the attack as you can and sharing it. And sharing it to GCHQ/NCSC, sharing it through your FSISAC, for instance, or other organizations, because if you got hit by these actors, chances are somebody else got hit. 3 or 4 months ago, the same group that took BA took Ticketmaster, and rumors have it, there is a report that just kind of popped up on Twitter from about 4 or 5 months ago that 960 online stores have been compromised by the Magecart group. So if you think that you've got problems, your neighbors probably have very similar problems. And I think that the only way we can get this together is have good, smooth IR processes, gather evidence, and then share that evidence.
Kind of the process that two heads are better than one.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a community, and we're really in it for the good of the community. And I know several banks are contributing. They have their incident response teams. They have threat modeling teams. I think Barclays has probably one of the best threat modeling team out there, or Bank of America. And they're creating great information, but you have to be mature enough as an organization to consume it. And so when we go back to asset management, for instance, what does normal look like? Is this even our box, right? Who got tagged with the? It was NASA that apparently they opened a closet to find a
Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, a Raspberry Pi plugged into the network. It's like, who owns this? I don't know. So I think that's all part of having good IR is to be able to give that information to your team and let them do their thing, and coordinate those efforts.
Sure. Okay. Before we move on to audience questions, I'd like to get your kind of final points and responses. Andrew, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, so obviously the findings from the Global Threat Report, they're released every quarter. Definitely have a read of it. It's a free resource that we compile and collate, so definitely check it out.
And you can find the Global Threat Incident Report downloadable on the page for this webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be also on the Carbon Black website as well. But yeah, definitely check it out. Some really good findings there. And also it helps you internally to kind of see what's trending, what's hot, and just kind of see subtle changes in the industry, the attack vectors, and that kind of stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah, I ravenously consume those reports from vendors and from not-for-profit organizations like CompTIA. It paints an excellent picture of what other businesses are facing in real terms, so that you can tangibly point to these examples. I think that's a very powerful data. I like the fact that this is from incident responders that are being called out, and dealing with those businesses that got compromised and are putting them back together. They're kind of like the firemen of our industry in a lot of ways. But I think it underscores the fact that there's no bored incident responders out there right now. I think what we're seeing is a shift in the threat landscape, a more sophisticated cyber criminal who will come at you from all sorts of different angles, and then also on top of this, with the shadow, I would say, of regulatory and class action and all of these other components that make Data Breach Club a very nasty place to be now.
That actually leads us quite neatly into our first audience question. So, Andrew, why is this kind of shift in attacker behaviour becoming so popular now? The shift towards the shift towards more use of things like commodity malware and living off the land binaries, and more collaboration, more use of island hopping, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, combined, all these techniques ultimately cast a wider net. So rather than going for a single victim, if you can capture and infect, 10,000 victims, there's much more likelihood that you're going to, gain, in some way, shape or form, whether it's through stolen credentials, stolen PII, financial records, etc. Why things are changing? I think going back to what I said earlier, there's a lot more code sharing that's going on right now. And it's funny because, just literally this weekend, there was a whole debacle going on Twitter with regards to YouTube taking down security-related videos.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But obviously, it's very controversial, and we could probably fill an hour just talking about that topic. But fundamentally, videos have been around for years. GitHub pages, repositories have been around for years. So the code has been out there. Attackers have been getting to grips. And while the blue teams in recent years have been kind of better equipped and better educated themselves with not just security tools, but just training and so on, the attackers are also one step ahead, because they know that as well as blue teams having their own playbooks, they have their playbooks as well. So the more we share, the more they learn from us, and it's a vicious circle, in my opinion.
Ian, would you say that the attackers and the grey and black hats have a bit of an edge there, in that blue teams, by their very nature, have to operate in the open and on public forums and on things like Twitter and things like that, whereas red teams and black hats can operate much more on places like the dark web and kind of more secretive, closed forums, that kind of thing. Would you say that gives them an edge?
I think it's potentially an edge, but when you go up against a government, friendly government or organization, you have a massive cyber threat intel group. You have many vendors in that cyber threat intel space. So slowly, the veil of the dark web is being peeled back. We've seen a number of takedowns of illicit marketplaces in the last little while. We know from the Mueller indictments that the ability to track Bitcoin to an individual and what they purchased with it is now a thing. We know that the United States Department of Justice is absolutely all about owning network of the adversary and gaining real-time information on their activities. And this, again, is disclosed in indictments. So I think the idea that red team malicious actors are potentially overwhelming the blue team defenses, I think, we're at the point where the landscape is starting to shift. Blue team is bringing together new products and services, EDR, being a great example of one. I think, are starting to take back the network. But again, we can only do that if there's an investment from the business. And if the business believes that security is in the best interest of the business and their customers, and they have a regulatory requirement to do so, then I think blue team can start winning. On the opposite side, blue team is confronted with an incredibly complex network of business drivers that don't necessarily push security, first and foremost in their mind. They need to be in the cloud. We need to be in the cloud now. And that's like this blue team is sitting around, how do we monitor the cloud? How do we secure the cloud? They may not have the skill set. They may not have the tool. And so I think, it's going to shift back and forth. But I think, the idea that red team is invulnerable, I think is starting to fade. Okay.
So you mentioned kind of business investment. Andrew, how do you think that smaller businesses, or those with perhaps more limited IT budgets who aren't necessarily tech organizations by trade, how do you think they can stop these kind of threats or defend themselves better against them?
Yeah, I mean, as going back to talking about the perimeter being at the endpoint nowadays is more common. Having a good EDR and next gen antivirus product to do to hopefully capture the vast majority of threats that exist on the endpoint. That's obviously probably the easiest place to start, because it doesn't necessarily require the sophistication of other technologies like network security monitoring or SIM tools. I would say they're definitely important, of course, but starting at the kind of the lower end of the kind of maturity life cycle, if you like, you want to kind of probably have more chance of catching the low-hanging fruit from the attacker's perspective by having something that runs on the endpoint and kind of building out your security detection layers from there.
And something that's easier to manage as well, presumably. Ian, what role do you think the reduction of complexity has in the modern kind of security landscape?
Well, yeah, if complexity and technological debt are like in the same column, attacking those with vigor and enthusiasm does have a huge net benefit for securing your infrastructure. I think, though, again, balance that with user awareness training. You have a potent mix. I agree, malware, anti-malware capabilities is part of the equation. But when I look at other data, 75% of these attacks are starting with a phishing email. Let's throw some email filtering in front of that. Right now, and this is the really interesting thing, when we look at cybersecurity essentials, there's some great stuff there, and what they're talking about does mitigate a lot of the attacks, but it does nothing for business email compromise, and they don't even mention the idea of having a backup. So there are some gaps there that I think, again, where your business is at, what your risk is, what your threat model is, really informs where you want to make those investments. And don't forget about the great technologies that are already sitting on that endpoint from both Apple and Microsoft. Things like BitLocker, things like AppLocker, things like, we like to malign Windows Defender, but it's better than nothing if you don't have a budget for an EDR solution. So there's so much there, I think, that we could do, but a lot of it is A, finding the resource to get it done, and B, I think, committing to it as part of your organizational plan.
Yeah, and just on that last point, if there's one thing that ransomware has taught us is to have a backup. So
Yeah.
even a small company with a very low budget can find a way of ensuring that their critical assets are backed up regularly in case of a ransomware.
Except for 2 towns in Florida, apparently.
Yeah,
right?
well, yeah.
So Andrew, you kind of, we've mentioned living off the land binaries and PowerShell and other built-in tools for Windows in particular that attackers can and do make use of. Are there any built-in tools that defenders can use to fight back against attackers? Beyond the kind of the things like BitLocker and whatnot that Ian's touched on.
Yeah, I mean, Ian touched on some great technologies that come, shipped out of the box, but there's so many good tools out there. Security Onion has been around for years and predominantly contains a bunch of network security monitoring tools. There's some really good repositories out there, even for companies with minimal budgets. But again, there's living off the land can be used for better or worse, right? So a lot of those tools, we talk about the Windows world, sysinternal sysmon is really key to monitoring the Windows event logs. So the Windows event logs will give you a base level kind of visibility, but Sysmon, which is produced by Microsoft, is free, and suddenly you get a lot more granular, in-depth information, which they've recently, I believe, added DNS login, quite verbose DNS login. So really, none of this has to be at the expense of the company. There's some great tools out there.
And don't take it sitting down. I think the other thing is let's attack back. And how do you attack back? You register complaints, you blacklist domains, you go after those email accounts, you troll them on Twitter. You do everything you can to bring visibility to what that attack looks like. Every time I got a number that was suggesting that I'm wanted by the immigration authorities, I pushed that up to Twitter and asked people to fax that number continuously.
Okay, so I think that's just about all the time we've got time for.
Cool.
I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating discussion. I feel like we've covered counter incident response, island hopping, lateral traversal, BlueKeep, Eternal Blue. Pretty wide,
much everything.
Yeah, pretty wide range of topics. I'd like to thank the viewers for joining us. As a reminder, you can get the Carbon Black Global Threat Incident Response Report from IT Pro or Carbon Black's website. And you can also watch this webinar on demand. So feel free to share it with colleagues, with supply chain partners, with family and friends. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.